Real quick before we get started, can everybody see my PowerPoint okay?
Looks good.
Okay, so could someone open us up with a word of prayer?
We got it.
Okay, thank you.
Father God, we thank you for this morning that we get to share this time together. Lord, please help us with this week coming up, all the anticipation and excitement and fear. Lord, they're in your hands. Lord, thank you for letting Sean do this. Lord, help us to understand what he has to say from you today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, guys, this week we are continuing our series looking at how and why to share our faith. And real quick, we want to briefly recap before we really dive in today, just to kind of set the stage for where we are. We're exploring how we can faithfully carry out the mission that Jesus has given us. That mission being to go out into the world and make the nations his disciples. This is the Great Commission. This is what he has given us. And we've said this is a grand calling. It's bigger than most of us tend to typically think. We are literally called to go into the world and make the world, by and large, his disciples. So how do we do that? What does that look like? What does faithfulness in this ministry actually look like day to day? Now, we've talked about some of the things that this entails. We've talked about, for example, what is the gospel that we're called to share? How specifically are we supposed to share it? What things are in the gospel that make it so powerful? We've talked about the ways to get a conversation started with someone when you want to share the gospel with them. So oftentimes it's not the most effective when you just start saying the gospel in a rote fashion. So we've talked about how do you start moving people towards a spiritual conversation. And Jason and Daniel gave y'all a little bit of role play with that, kind of showing you in different scenarios how that might work. And then the past week, we started looking at, okay, when I'm sharing the gospel, what do I do if someone has a question or someone has an objection? And we started talking about the subject of apologetics. We started talking about what it means to offer a defense of our faith. And last week, we talked about different types of apologetics. We talked about the different styles people use when they are defending the faith. Things like people will sometimes focus on, logical arguments to prove that God exists and Jesus exists and he rose from the dead. We talked about people who will use evidences to say, look, here's reasons you can trust the Bible. Here's reasons you can trust that Jesus was a real person, and so on. We talked about people who will try to convince people that not only is Christianity true, but that it's good that it's true. You want it to be true. And we talked about people who will just kind of go straight on the offensive and say, not only is Christianity true, but everything else is false. And I can argue to you that your belief, whatever it may be, is false and wrong. And so it's not me who should be on the defensive, it's you, and things like that. But we said last week that this week we were going to talk about what are some of the actual challenges that you're going to come across and how should you respond to them. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dive in and we're going to look at what are some of the most common challenges that we're going to face as we share our faith as Christians, and then how can we grow in our ability to answer those challenges. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth on any of these because we've got, a good bit of ground to cover today, common challenges, common arguments for the faith, and then where to go to find answers. My goal today, because we are going to touch on this topic again in the future, my goal today is basically just to get you guys kind of oriented on where to look when you have a challenge or a question that you don't know how to answer. What are the places that you can go to, and what are the things that you can do to kind of prepare for this? So before we really get rolling, does anybody have any questions or comments about where we've been or where we're going? Mom, I see a box over your thing. Are you muted?
I am muted. Did you need me to be unmuted?
It looked like you were talking on my screen.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. So I didn't know if you had a question and you were asking.
Nope, not yet.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's no questions or comments, we will just dive right in. So let's start looking at the various types of what I'm calling apologetic encounters that you might have as you try to share your faith. These are the different types of people that you'll encounter and the sorts of questions and arguments that they'll ask. Now, to kick things off, I'm going to start with probably what is, in my mind, the least likely encounter you're going to have, or at the very least, it will often be in addition to another one of the categories I'm giving you, and that is the encounter with the strict atheist or the agnostic. These are typically very popular for people to write about in apologetic books or in presentations they give on apologetics, because the atheist and the agnostic, to be completely honest, are some of the easiest positions to argue against when you start hearing their arguments. All you have to do to argue against them is argue for the existence of God. You don't actually have to argue any of the central truth claims of Christianity, which makes this kind of a very easy argument. But the reason this is probably the least likely you're going to encounter is, strictly speaking, atheism is still pretty rare in our culture. The vast majority of people in our culture believe in some variety of the supernatural. They believe in some form of spirituality, be it pagan or Christian or Judaic or something. There is usually some type of spiritual awareness to the people that you will meet. They aren't, strictly speaking, atheists. Agnostics can be more of a varying category. To give you a quick definition, an atheist is a person who says, I do not believe that there is a God. Sometimes they'll get really fancy and they'll try to say, I simply lack a belief that there is a God. That's a way to kind of excuse themselves from having to prove anything. Agnostics are more of the people who say, look, I just don't know. I don't know what's out there. I don't know what it is, and I'm not going to take a position on it. I'm not going to have a belief on this. And this is, strictly speaking, as I said, not a very common position. Most people will acknowledge they have some sort of beliefs, and most people have some beliefs in a supernatural being, a god or gods, some form of religion, if you will, or at least some form of religious faith if they don't have an established religion. A lot of people in our culture today pick and choose and just take some things from Christianity, some things from Mormonism and paganism and things like that. But the atheist and the agnostic, what sorts of arguments will they offer? What sorts of objections will they have when you're sharing the faith, and so on? Well, typically, when you're trying to share the faith, their arguments or their objections are going to focus on things like, does God actually exist? You're talking to me about my sin against God. You're talking to me about God's desire to be reconciled to me. Well, I don't believe God exists. So what do you have to say to me? If I don't believe God exists, then none of the rest of this stuff matters. And so they'll lodge arguments against the existence of God. Things like, for example, well, God can't exist because of X, Y, or Z. Typically, the most common argument you'll hear in this vein is the problem of evil. God can't exist because so much evil is going on in the world. But other people will get a bit more sophisticated and they'll say things like, the Christian conception of God is impossible. It contains too many logical contradictions, so God can't exist. Things like, for example, one there's a book out there written by a variety of atheists called The Impossibility of God. And one of the arguments that I had to write a paper in response to was that God is impossible. He can't exist. He's a logical contradiction because the Bible tells us that God can know what is going on in time, and yet that God is a timeless being. And the guy went through various philosophical hoops to prove that if you are a timeless being, you cannot know what is going on in time. That would violate your timelessness. And so they'll get really fancy sometimes with some of the arguments they'll do. They'll also argue against the reliability of the Bible. They'll say, well, all this stuff you're telling me is coming from a man-made book, the Bible. It's no different than any other man-made book. Why would I place such a level of trust that I commit my entire life to this way of teaching into a book that is just a book? It's just flawed, and we have proof that it's flawed. You know, here are the errors in your Bible. They'll often take great pride and pleasure in pointing out where, you know, for example, a copyist error has entered into the Bible we have today, or where one verse seems to contradict another, and they will put these out there as reasons to not believe the things that we are telling them. Now, you'll get some very extreme forms of atheism out there today. Some call themselves like mythicists, and they believe things like Jesus never even existed. He wasn't a person who existed in history. That's kind of an extreme position because even most atheists will admit there was a guy, Jesus, even if they don't believe any of the supernatural things that are claimed about him. And so you'll get people saying, well, he's just a recreation of other pagan myths that existed at the time. Great examples are people who believe that the apostles copied the story of the Egyptian god Horus and claimed that he was Jesus, and they just basically fabricated the whole thing. These are things that you will encounter as you talk to people out there, especially, for example, if you've ever encountered atheists who spend a lot of time on the internet, because on the internet there is a ton of web forums and YouTube videos and things like that, all designed to promote this idea. So while it's not all that prevalent in real life, you go on the internet and atheism is everywhere. But so this is one of the types of apologetic encounters that you're likely to face. You will likely at some point come across somebody who espouses atheism or agnosticism and will lodge arguments against the reliability of the Bible or the existence of God, and so on. Now, in between each of these, please feel free to stop me with questions, but I'll go ahead and stop myself right now. Does anybody have any questions on atheism? Anybody have examples of where they've seen it or encountered it? All right, well, we'll just keep rolling then. All right, next up, the most likely thing you're going to encounter in this world as you're talking to people is the religious non-Christian. This is your Mormon, your Jehovah's Witness, your Jewish faith, your Muslim faith, your Hindu, your Shinto, and so on. All the different religious faiths that exist out there. And there are thousands of varieties of religious faith that are not Christian in our world. And as I said before, the vast majority of people in our world believe in some form of the supernatural, have some sort of religious faith. And so this is likely the most common encounter you are going to have. And here, what you're going to encounter is questions and arguments that center mostly on the very specific and especially exclusive claims of Christianity as opposed to other religions. You'll likely have a lot of discussion about who Jesus is and what he came to do. For example, if you're talking with a Muslim and you get to the point where Jesus came to save us, well, the Muslims believe in Jesus. They believe he was a real person. They believe he did miraculous things. They believe he spoke from God. They just don't believe that he was a savior or the Son of God. And so you'll have questions or arguments focused on them trying to prove their view of these things. Other examples might be if you are talking to the Jehovah's Witness and you're speaking about Jesus. You know, you are calling him the Son of God. You are saying that he is divine, one member of the Trinity. They don't believe that. They believe that he is an angel, that he was created by God, and that he does play a role in salvation, that he is important, but not that he is God. And so you'll have arguments that will center on proving it. People will quote verses, you know. They'll quote their own scriptures if, for example, you're dealing with a Muslim. And it will get more and more complicated as you get out to the religions that don't follow any sort of Judeo-Christian background. The non-Semitic religions, as we might say. So, for example, Hinduism. If you're talking about the different forms of Hinduism out there and the concepts of the gods and things like reincarnation and these sorts of things, you'll get arguments as to why they believe these are true, and you'll have objections to the exclusive claims of Christianity that, for example, there is only one God and that he is the creator of all things, and that there is no reincarnation, there is only the hope of resurrection. And you'll have to argue through these things to people. And the word of warning I want to give here is that these are the most common types of arguments that you'll come into because you're most likely to meet a religious non-Christian. But these are the arguments that require you to do the most study and require you to have very good listening skills. Doing study is very important if you know you're going to be talking to, for example, a Muslim or a Mormon or something like that. You want to look into what do they believe. You want to find out what have Christians said in their encounters with them in the past. But you also want to have good listening skills because, as I can attest to, regardless of whatever the official faith teaches, you'll meet a lot of people who don't believe that, who still claim to be a member of that faith. Just like in Christianity, you have a lot of people who will say, I am a Christian, but not believe a lot of the stuff we talk about. You're likely to encounter someone who says, I am a Mormon, and not believe a lot of the stuff they talk about, or I am a Muslim, and not believe a lot of the stuff they talk about. And so this is something that you need to listen to the person that you are talking to so that you know specifically what to address and how to address it. All right, does anybody have any questions or comments about this before we keep rolling? All right. Is this making sense? I'll say that.
It makes sense, but I was going to say, just as we believe wholeheartedly in the Bible, they're going to believe wholeheartedly in whatever authority they have too.
Yes, which we'll get to that when we talk about arguments you can make for our faith. But it will require you to know a good bit about their faith or learn a good bit about their faith. You don't have to know it going in. But for example, if you have a Mormon neighbor and they constantly want to talk to you, then it would be a good idea to start looking into the Mormon faith and learning, why do we say our text, our Bible is accurate and reliable and points to the true faith? And why do we say that their version of the Bible that they've come up with isn't? You know, why do we believe these things? And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. All right, well, let's keep rolling. The next most likely group that you're going to encounter is those who have been burned by the church. These are those who in some way used to be in a church or a part of the Christian community, and something happened that has turned them off to Christianity. And it can be any number of things. It can be something huge and glaring and awful, or it can be something small and petty. These things vary depending on who you're talking to. With this, as you're sharing the gospel, you're talking about the kindness of God, his love for us, things like that, you'll get questions or arguments that center on the misdeeds of Christians and how that speaks to the God they serve. Or, for example, you'll get questions about the inability of believers to live consistently with their values. You might get the objection, well, none of you actually believe these things. And the problem with this one is very often the people that you are encountering do have some legitimate grievance with whatever church they were a part of. I say in your notes and here on the screen, you have to be very careful in these sorts of encounters, not only because you're speaking to someone who is likely an unbeliever and you want to come to the faith, but you have to take care for your own sake as well. You do not want to fall into the trap of simply defending your team. You want to acknowledge if a wrong has been done to this person, we need to call that out and condemn it and sympathize with them, because it does us no good to ignore evil in the church. And I would wager most of us have many, many examples of evil done in the church. I would wager most of us, if we thought hard enough, could come up with examples of evils we have done in the church. And so it's things that we look at and we say, we've all sinned. It is very likely that this person has a legitimate grievance, be it small or be it something, horrific. They likely have been hurt by someone within the church, and we need to not just fall into the habit of just saying, oh, well, you're probably, taking this out of context, or you're probably, too emotional about this. It's not that big a deal. No, if Christianity, the people, has burned someone, we need to be able to call that out if we're ever going to commend Christianity, the faith, to someone. So we'll talk a bit more about these sorts of things, but you will likely encounter something like this if you haven't already. Common examples of ways people have been burned by the church: either someone had an authority figure who misused their authority, or they were a part of a church that was constantly seeking money. That's very common in our day, and they get turned off by the greed of it. You could have someone who was in a church and they were teaching heresy, and it was so wild and so false that they looked at it and they said, I can't possibly believe this stuff. A great example of this from more recent times, if y'all think back to 2011, and I just realized I said 2011 was recent, and it's almost 10 years ago now, but look back to 2011 and you had the incident with Harold Camping, a teacher who used to run a popular Christian radio station, who convinced tons of people that the end of the world was coming. And they spent their life savings, they bought billboards and all this type of stuff, and then the fact that we're still here should say the end of the world didn't come. And then they were left destitute and impoverished because of this man and his teachings. And many of them simply left the faith. They simply left behind Christianity because to them it was the thing that ruined their lives. And so this is a very difficult challenge to deal with, because you not only have to get past the emotional hurt, but you have to get past the misdeeds of others coloring your own actions, be that fair or not. Does anybody have any questions or comments about this before we keep going? All right. Now we have those who are hurt and suffering, and these can honestly fall into any of the other categories out there. Now, what is the challenge here? Well, the challenge is when you're talking about a God who loves us, a God who wants to save us and care for us and be with us, and yet they look out into the world, and this world that this God we're telling them about has created is full of suffering and evil and death and sin. And so they look at what we're saying about the goodness of God, and they look at their situation or their own personal hurt and suffering, and they say, these things are incompatible. I will not believe in a God like this. Or you'll get some who will honestly say, I don't care if that God exists. I hate him because of what he's done to me. And these are, as I say, some of the most difficult apologetic encounters, because the arguments you're going to have to deal with, the questions you're going to have to answer, aren't going to be like the questions you get from the atheist who's trying to form a rational objection to the existence of God, or a logical argument that you have to talk about the premises of to see if it necessarily leads to the conclusion. More often than not, the person you encounter is going to have emotional arguments, an emotional objection to God's existence, because of the hurt and the pain that they have been subject to. And many times they'll think that God himself is the one inflicting this pain upon them, and they will be angry at him. In these sorts of encounters, it's important, like with those who have been burned by the church, that we sympathize, because all of us know the experience of suffering in the world, be it big or small. All of us know the experience of dealing with the world's hardships day in and day out. And so it's a type of encounter that's going to require you to empathize with the person you're talking to quite a bit. And we'll talk a bit more about how to deal with this either this week or next week, because this is really the most common, not the most common, but the most difficult objection you're probably going to face. So we might spend a little bit more time on this in the coming week. So you might have any questions or comments about this before we keep rolling? Okay. All right. So what are some of the most common arguments that you are going to encounter? And I'll pause here for just a second so I can refresh my voice. What are some of the most common arguments that you're going to hear specifically in our day? Well, one of the most common is the Bible is unreliable. It's just a book written by any other man, like those written by any other man, I should say. It's not something to base your entire life on. There are obvious errors within it. It's obviously not the book of God, the word of God, as we say. And they'll make this argument by doing things like pointing out copyist errors in the Bible, pointing out verses they feel contradict one another, pointing out the style of transmission of our Bible, the fact that none of us possess the original writings of the apostles. All we have are copies of 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 the original writings. And they'll say, isn't it just inherently unreliable to say, well, this is what they said? Haven't you ever played the game of telephone? And you know that when something is copied over and over again, it just gets worse and worse. And so they'll just say, well, the Bible is unreliable. They'll also advocate that Jesus was a myth. I talked about this one earlier, but it's becoming increasingly popular in our time thanks to things like, you can find this on YouTube. I don't recommend watching it, but you can find the Zeitgeist film, where you've got a guy with a very dramatic voice narrating this little documentary that was done by I'm guessing just some random people. And they claim that Jesus is a copy of the myth of Horus, that he's a copy of the Mithraic gods, that he's a copy of all these other world religions just kind of jammed together into one big conglomerate, and that he never even existed, that people just took various elements of other deities' stories and combined them together and called it Jesus. Now, I will warn you, if you watch it, the narrator does it in a very dramatic voice, but if you look into the claims of the film, almost none of them that have any significance, none of them that have any significance, but almost none of the claims made in the film overall are true. You cannot find any record of the stuff they're talking about. And in fact, most of the things they claim about the ancient pagan religions are false as well. They don't even know those religions, much less Christianity. But because it's a popular thing that went viral in our time, a lot of people are talking about this sort of argument. You'll get people who say, oh, well, Christianity is just a superstition. It believes in miracles and it believes in the supernatural. And we know today better. We know that that's not true. I've heard atheists make an argument from the stage, which has always baffled me as to why this is an argument, but they'll say, you cannot ride in an airplane and use your computer and still believe in miracles. I don't know why, but that's what they will say. And so Christianity is just a superstition, and dismissing it outright is something that you'll come across. You'll also come across people who, if they are from other religious faiths, will say, well, your beliefs are corruptions of the true faith. Our religious texts are better. My mom mentioned this a few minutes ago, the idea that they have their own texts that they believe in wholeheartedly. For example, the Muslims believe that the Quran and the interpretations of the Quran and the Hadith are more important than the Bible. They believe that the Bible has become corrupt. Same thing with the Mormons, same thing with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on. You'll also get the argument, well, Christians are responsible for so much evil in the world. The Crusades, the Westboro Baptist Church that's out there. How can you expect me to trust what you say about your God if your people are doing so many things that I find objectionable and evil? And then finally, the statement of the problem of evil. How can you say that a good God exists when blank, insert evil here, goes on in the world? These are very common objections that you will encounter as you're sharing the faith. And so it's good to take these and look into them. This is just a sample list of 6, but you can take this and from this go look at some of the resources that I'm going to give you later on, and just start forming your own answers to these, because you are likely, if you're sharing your faith, to encounter someone who says something like one of these things. Now, we've talked about arguments against the faith. We've talked about the types of encounters you are going to have where people object to the faith. What are some of the arguments for the faith? I don't want you to just think that what you're doing is always going to be being on your heels, trying to answer every objection that comes your way. There are actually positive arguments for what we believe. It's not just that we can refute every objection and therefore we're fine in believing what we're believing, we're still safe. It's that we actually have good reasons to believe what we believe, and these reasons honestly need to be answered by other people as well. Well, let's look at a few. First off, you have the fact that the Bible is the best attested, and by that I mean the most documented and reliably transmitted work of antiquity. And we'll get to that second part here in just a second, but I want to share with you an example. In our day, some of you may have heard of him. We have a scholar, a non-believing scholar. I think he calls himself an agnostic these days, but he used to be a Christian. His name is Bart Ehrman. And he makes his living going from university to university and doing these speaking engagements and writing books where he talks about the fact that the Bible is unreliable, that because it has been transmitted in the way it was transmitted, with copyists copying the scriptures and then handing it down to the next generation, and then those copies being copied and so on, he says it's just all inherently unreliable. If you don't have the originals, and if you don't have the very first writings, you can't possibly know that the things we have in our Bible today is what the apostles said. And he'll point out examples of where one copy varies from another copy. And he'll talk about the fact that there are more differences between the copies that we have currently in our possession than there are copies that we have in our possession. So I think we have something like 7,000 different New Testament manuscripts that we compare as we make our New Testament today. And he'll say those vary between each other in more places than the 7,000 manuscripts we have. So there's 45,000 variances between these. And he'll say all this in a very scary voice when he's presenting it. He'll talk about how inherently unreliable everything is. And he will make the case, if you don't have the originals, you can't know that this is what they said. Now, The thing about Bart Ehrman is that he is not presenting to Christians any new information. He's basically taking all of the information we have that we talk about when we talk about how did we get the Bible we have today, and he's just repeating it back to us in a very scary voice. He's not saying anything we don't already know. And when pressed on this, he will actually say things like, okay, well, yes, these 40,000 differences I'm mentioning, none of them have any impact on Christian doctrine. It's things like, is the word and in this verse, or but, in this verse? Or is there a 1 here, or is it a 10? These sorts of differences, copyist errors, that sort of thing. And he says, and none of these affect any actual Christian belief or doctrine. Then if you press him on it and you'll say, well, no, we don't have the originals, but we have copies. He'll say, yes, and out of all the works from antiquity that we know of, the Bible is the best attested, meaning that by comparing the copies, we can reliably come back to what we think the original is. It's the same way we do works like the works of Plato or the history of the Roman Empire, things like that. All of these works we trust with much less attestation than the Bible has, and yet the Bible is the best out of all of these. And it's not even close. Like, the Bible is the most reliably transmitted and attested work of antiquity, because so many people took part in copying this work down because it was the holy book of the religion. And so he will admit when pressed, well, yes, if you are to compare the Bible to anything else, it stands head and shoulders above it, but I still don't believe it because you don't have the originals. And so it just comes down to kind of a petty objection, I think I could say. And so this is something that you can tell people. Out of all the works of antiquity that you know and you believe that they transmit to you real information. So, for example, the history of the Roman emperors, everything we know about Rome comes from these early works where people documented the life and careers of the Roman emperors. If you believe this is genuine information, you have all the more reason to believe that the Bible is transmitting to you genuine information. Moreover, when you read the Bible, and specifically when you read, like, for example, the Gospels, they bear all the marks of eyewitness testimony to real events. They don't bear the marks of myth. They don't bear the marks of like pagan creation myths or pagan miraculous stories that are steeped in all sorts of fantastical things. They just seem like kind of sober, almost in the case of Luke, legal accounts of what happened, like a witness testimony. In fact, you find out that that's the reason Luke wrote, the Gospel and Acts, was to communicate to people why Paul was out doing the things he did when he got arrested, as kind of part of this defense. Many people believe that's the reason he created these things. And so when you look at the Bible, you have a very reliable work of antiquity that seems to testify to real events that happened in the past, and these events are God's acts of redemption and God's miraculous intervention through Jesus. That's a very powerful reason to believe. You also have the argument that a lot of considerations from both philosophy and science point to the truth of the Christian faith. If any of you are familiar with the intelligent design movement or the fine-tuning argument for the Christian faith, the idea that the universe seems set up to promote life on this planet specifically, and that everything seems tuned to promote human flourishing, the idea of this paradise that God has set us in creation. You have the intelligent design movement that seems to be putting forth evidence that says, you can look at life on this earth and see that there is a design behind it, a purpose behind it, which implies the existence of a God who designed it. And you have tons of philosophical arguments throughout history that point to the existence of a God. One of the most well-known ones is the idea that, through various logical means, you can show that the universe had a beginning, and that beginning has to have a cause, and that cause is God. This was, I believe, the first mover argument of Aristotle, and it's been continued all the way down to today. You have the moral argument that I mentioned last week, where you point to morality, pointing to the existence of a God, that sort of thing. These considerations point to the truth of what we say when we're talking about the Christian faith. There's also very good evidence that what the Bible says about Jesus is true, including specifically the testimony on the resurrection. I highly encourage all of y'all to look into the evidence in favor of the resurrection. In fact, I think at one point we did an apologetics seminar here specifically on the issue of the resurrection for Easter. When you look at the testimony and you look at the events that surrounded the resurrection, and you put together everything we know from history, it really does seem like the only good explanation is that there was this guy, Jesus. He claimed to be God. He was crucified, and then lo and behold, he rose from the dead. Whatever explanation you offer to that, it seems like that happened. And so this is a very powerful reason for believing that the testimony of Christianity, that Jesus was raised from the dead by God as a sign of his approval of his work of redemption, is true. You also have, and this kind of gets to the question that we had earlier, you get the argument that the holy books of other religions are fraudulent and contain many, many, many errors. The arguments that get put forth against the Bible honestly apply much more to the holy books of other religions than they do the Bible. For example, when you allege errors in a holy book, you can look to the Book of Mormon, for example, and you can see things like steel alloy being mentioned before it was ever developed. You can see horses in America before the Spaniards brought them over, and things like this. You can read about how the Native Americans are of Semitic origin, and DNA tests have been done that show that's not true. And all of these things that are just outright false are contained in these holy books. You can also point out where different versions of the holy books disagreed with one another, not just in terms of like minor things, like in the Bible, in one verse you'll read that there were 10 men who did something, and another verse you'll read that there were 100. An error of where you put the decimal point, so to speak, that can be easily attributed to a copyist somewhere along the line. No, these are things like God did this, and then another one said, no, God did not do that. And you'll get this, for example, in certain versions of the Quran that are attested to in the past writings that have since been destroyed, unfortunately. And you'll get it also in, for example, the Book of Mormon and its comparison to things like the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, the Holy Scriptures of the Mormon Church. And you'll see where these have been revised to agree with one another, because people were reading them and going, oh wait, that doesn't match that. We've got to change it. And so you can look at these things and say, not just ours is true, and there's good reason to believe ours is true, but also if you really examine the history of yours, you can see that there are many problems with it, and that it's not something worthy of your belief. And then you've got the argument that Christianity, not only do these things show the truth of Christianity, but Christianity is also good and desirable. I've often said, if you listen to what people say they want in the world, if you listen to what people say they want out of life, what they want for meaning, it all points to Christianity. It points to the fact that if people believed Christianity were true, this world would be a much better place. This is something we should want to be true. And that's a powerful reason for belief as well, because it meets our existential needs, as it were, not just our logical requirements. So these are common arguments you'll often find them more fleshed out. In fact, in the resources I'm going to recommend, you'll find all of these and more. I recommend looking into these and studying a bit more in these. So let's talk about how to go deeper. Well, real quick, I'll ask, does anybody have any questions before we keep moving?
Oh, and that last point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris, I can't hear you very well.
Okay, I'm sorry.
There you go.
What I was saying is that the last point you made about Christianity being desirable.
Yes.
Earlier, you also alluded to the point that there are certain actors who have done things. Well, I mean, they profess Christianity, but they have done things which cause others to become sort of wary about Christians. You know, and as a consequence of that, it may not be the case in all instances, that is, that there are people who think Christianity is desirable because they are using people, these same bad actors, to judge Christianity. You know, so it just seems to me that it is so important for us, for those of us who claim Christianity, to conduct ourselves in such a way that we really shine. We glorify God. God is glorified, you know, from our acts, you know, so that people see what we do and say to themselves, look, I want to be, you know, a part of this Christianity movement.
Yeah.
You know.
And yeah, you're absolutely right. The biggest problem Christians have in defending the faith and spreading the faith is Christians. It's often the case that the behavior and the attitude of Christians does much more to hinder the spread of the faith than any argument that can be lodged against it. I believe this is why when Peter in 1 Peter 3 talks about making a defense of the faith, giving a reason for the hope that's in you, he adds, with gentleness and respect. The idea of Christians being a people who do good, a people who are respectful, a people who are meek and you know, hopeful in this world is something that has always been our greatest testimony. And yet very often you find, as you said, lots of people do a lot of damage, you know, negating that testimony. And oftentimes we'll do it if, you know, through our sin, we will give false presentations of what we believe by what we do. And it is something that we need to be aware of. And honestly, in a lot of these encounters, for example, when we're dealing with somebody who's been burned by the church, one of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to do kind of the hard work of undoing the work that had been done. And we're going to have to do the work of showing, look, this is what they did. This is what Christianity says. And the problem is Christianity is desirable and good. Christians are often not. And this is a real issue. And so there's many things that we can do to say this, the Christian, was wrong. And we can know this because they were out of line with what they said they believed. And we need to be able to point to that to people and say, yes, we condemn that. That was wrong. But it was not what Christianity is. For example, we often have people who do this with reference to the Crusades, or you know, in the history of America, the witch burnings and things like this, the sham trials that were going on that would often kill people willy-nilly because people were on, as we colloquially say today, a witch hunt, as it were. And Christians have performed many evil acts throughout history that color our ability to effectively spread the faith. So yes, absolutely something we need to be aware of and to be ready to answer for. All right, let's keep going. How do you go deeper with apologetics? Where do you find answers to tough questions? Where do you find help formulating arguments and answering the challenges that you're going to encounter? Well, first, the good news. And I said this recently to our high school group when we did an apologetics night with the high schoolers. The best news I can give anyone when they're facing challenges to their faith is, even if you don't know the answer, there is one. If you run across a question or an argument that you've never heard before, it leaves you stumped, you are worrying, you're doubtful, the best assurance I can give you is from the book of Ecclesiastes: there is nothing new under the sun. Every argument that exists today is just a various form of an argument that existed 2,000 years ago. And any argument you encounter will have thousands of years of Christian thought where people have been writing about these arguments. They've been answering them in various ways. One of the things I said to the high schoolers was, if you encounter any challenge that you don't know how to answer, you can not only go to the previous thought of Christians from ages past and find answers, but if you find answers that you look at and you go, well, that doesn't exactly ring true to me, I don't know that I want to use that as my answer to this. Well, guess what? Because there's been 2,000 years of this, you'll probably find a dozen more different types of answers to that question, where people with different perspectives, different ways of approaching these questions have said, you know what? Here's why this does not shake my faith in the truth of Christianity. And this is a powerful resource that you have at your disposal, is the history of the church and the vast amount of thought that has gone before you on these issues, these questions, these arguments that you're likely to encounter. Now, the bad news is that you have to do a lot of work to sometimes find those answers. And so this is where resources come in. As I say in your notes, to hone your apologetic mind, you need to become more familiar with the arguments people have given, and doing that often requires reading, it requires study, it requires looking into these sorts of things. Well, how do you do that? Well, there's some great introductory resources that I can recommend to you that kind of give you broad overviews of these sorts of things, and will contain within themselves resources for going even deeper. It's kind of a rabbit hole that you never really reach the end of. So, what are some good resources to get you started? I'm going to recommend several. By no means are these all of them, but these are some good resources to kind of go with. One is a very broad resource, and I like recommending this to people. It's the Apologetics Study Bible. And basically what it is it's not your normal study Bible. It doesn't give you like background information on every verse and place names and things like that. Rather, what it does is, as you're reading through the Bible, wherever there's a verse or a teaching that has presented an opportunity for someone to argue against the Christian faith, or wherever there's something that often plays into arguments against the Christian faith, they have either a short little note or an article kind of explaining to you how this can be answered, how this can be reconciled with some other verse, things like that. Plus, throughout the Bible, they have a lot of longer articles dealing with some of the tougher topics in Christianity that people often have questions about. It's a great little resource. I don't necessarily agree with everything they say, but it's a good resource, and I never agree with everything anybody says. So I highly recommend it. Another one that I recommend is a very small, sort of almost choose your own adventure book, if you remember those. and it's called What's Your Worldview? What's Your Worldview? And if you look it up on Amazon or something like that, you're likely to find it. I think it has a big question mark on the cover. And basically what it does is it just asks the reader a series of questions that your answers to them will lead you to a page telling you, out of the major worldviews that exist out there, which is yours most close to. And if it's not the Christian worldview, it also offers a short little critique on why that worldview is not the correct one. And so it's basically designed to be given to a non-believer and let them kind of find, okay, well, here's what I believe. And then the book critiques that in a very gentle way. But it can also be used very effectively by a Christian to learn what the different worldviews believe by going through and seeing how the different questions are answered, and then learning what the problems with those worldviews are. So things like the Muslim worldview or the Hindu worldview or things like that. Another one that I'd recommend is a book called Cultural Apologetics. I thought I had the name of the guy who wrote it, but if you just Google Cultural Apologetics book, you'll find this on Amazon. And it's basically a book that lays out the technique of trying to communicate the idea, as we've been talking about, Christianity being not only true, but good and desirable. And I recommend that one. One that I recommend across the board, even if you're not interested in apologetics at all, this is just a book I recommend to pretty much everyone, is The Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties by Gleason Archer. Gleason Archer, I think it's Gleason. He basically goes through and chapter by chapter, verse by verse of the Bible, he gives you the most common questions people have asked about verses in the Bible. And he doesn't cover every verse, but mainly he covers every book. And things that when you're reading the Bible, you will have likely asked at some point. He gives you a sample answer to the questions you might have on these things. Amazing book. I highly recommend it. Again, don't agree with everything he says, but it is an enormous help when reading the Bible. And then I also recommend Cold Case Christianity. It's kind of a modern day version of the evidential approach to apologetics. So giving evidences for why you should believe in the Bible, why you should believe in the resurrection of Jesus, these sorts of things, the existence of God. And it's a good, simple, straightforward way of presenting it. And it's also an interesting way of presenting it because the guy who's presenting it is an old cold case detective, where he'd go and he'd look at murder scenes that have been cold, quote unquote, for 20 something years. And he'd try to piece back together from old evidences what the truth of the situation was. And he does this with Christianity and finds, well, it's very reliable according to these techniques of investigation. So Cold Case Christianity, I recommend to you. Now, finally, the last thing I'll recommend, and I know we're running short on time at this point, is that it can be helpful as you read and think through some of the challenges to your faith to begin putting into words, as you are going through, the reasons you find most compelling for believing in Christianity. Why is it that you personally believe? This is something I recommend everybody do, because honestly, the reasons you believe will likely be more impactful to someone than a stock argument that you took from a book. I did this myself. If y'all like, I can actually send you my list that I put together a while back as like a little additional handout later in the week, where I listed the 10 reasons I found most compelling to me why to believe in the faith. And what you can find is people who you meet who share your perspective, who share your way of thinking. These might be especially powerful to them as well. And so this is something I recommend doing. Just start trying to think through, why do I believe? And it can be as simple as something. This is even on my list. On my list I call it the shepherd's voice, where Jesus in John chapter 10 says, "My sheep will hear my voice; they will know me, and they will follow me." I have on my list when I read the Bible, I don't just hear the words of just some random guy who was writing 2,000 years ago. In the Bible, I hear the word of God, because it seems to testify that it is more than just a simple book. All right. I will definitely send out my list then. I see in the chat. So I'll send it out. I do recommend don't just replicate my list, because again, it'll even say at the top of this that these are all subjective arguments, that they make sense to me. They might not make sense to anyone else, but if you think like I do, it might be very compelling to you. So I'll send those out. But I recommend doing this yourself as well. All right, I am going to go ahead and stop my screen share. And apparently my mail wanted to tell me that something was held for me. And we are kind of out of time. So I will go ahead and let y'all go, because I know some of y'all have places to be.